Oh, man, this is super uncomfortable. Thank you, Mona, for this one. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Irenicast. We are a weekly podcast dedicated to the exploration of faith and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Jeff.
Hey, I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week, we are going to discuss evolution. But before that, let's check in with our hosts and find out how everyone's doing. How is everyone doing?
Not so good, guys. Yeah, I had a breakup yesterday. So,
ouch. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. But, I'm nursing a bottle of whiskey, and I've been singing the song Turn Around at the top of my lungs, which is making me feel better. So I think I'll survive. Turn around, bright eyes. Have you guys seen that video where that lady sings this song in like 20 different voices of female singers, and it is unbelievably talented?
I have seen that. It is pretty amazing.
It's so good. Her Celine Dion. She's like, and I need you more than now.
Those videos are a guilty pleasure of mine, watching people do like their random impressions of people.
Yeah.
It's really good.
How about you, Alan?
So maybe you'll be proud of me. I, in my sermon on Sunday, because I've been preaching at my church, the liturgy was going through Jesus cleansing the temple, and I used a spring cleaning joke in there.
What?
I don't understand.
I don't understand.
Oh, okay.
Why would we be proud of you?
I know. I am super proud of myself. I thought it was really funny. Like, spring cleaning,
man.
Jesus cleans out the temple. You know what? To be completely honest, I heard that from my neighbor. No, my neighbor heard that I was preaching, and he doesn't go to church or anything, but he was like, oh, it's like spring cleaning. And I thought it was hilarious and put it in there. And everybody laughed. I don't know if it's out of compulsion or they really thought it was funny. But
well, the first question is, what was the specific joke?
No, it was just like, I forgot how it came up, but I was like introducing something. And then I said, in the spirit of spring cleaning, we come to the text where Jesus cleans out the temple.
Oh. And second question, what is the average age of your congregation?
See, I was going to remark something like this. I was going to talk about that, but I didn't necessarily want to put my church on blast. But it's probably in the 70s, if I'm going to be completely honest.
Okay. Then that's hilarious, dude. That's good.
I know. I told that to my wife before I even used the joke. I was like, this is going to go over well, specifically because of the demographic.
Yes.
People, yeah.
Well, then congratulations. I'm proud that you know your audience well enough to tell a joke like that.
What we need in this podcast is like a little sound effect of cheers, because I'm putting my hands in the air and I feel like someone should be clapping for me.
Maybe in post we'll put in some.
Just start singing Turnaround.
See, now that song's going to be stuck in my head, Mona. Thank you so much. And I spent years trying to get that song out of my head, because I don't know if you remember, but we used to do that as a human video in our youth group.
Oh my God, we did that. What? Totally forgot.
I have literally listened to that song a million times. It is, yeah, it was I actually stole that human video. I made it Christian. I took it from a anti-drug assembly at a high school.
Wait, so isn't it like we had this girl? Okay, so wait, I'm reaching deep into the recesses of my memory. We had this girl who was like, I don't need you, parental figures, and like stormed out the door in the song, the human video, which is like, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's like a music video. It's like a live music video. Okay, it's like a live music video with humans. So you're like acting like this choreographed sequence to the song in person. So anyway, yeah, so she storms out of the house like, I don't need you guys. And then she sins a lot, and then she comes back. So her turning around is repentance. Is that right, Jeff?
Exactly. Yeah, and it was actually stolen because initially it was the drugs would surround the girl when she left her parents, and then her friends would come help pull her out of the circle of drugs. But then obviously, because it's Christian, we had to change it. So Jesus saves her from the circle of sins. So we changed it from all the different specific drugs to like lust.
What kind of sin were there again? Oh yeah.
Okay, no joke. Mona, I think your sister sent me a picture on text message the other day of my wife and her dressed up as like the demons of whatever, the ones that Jeff's talking about. I'm pretty sure they did that exact human video.
We did.
And they owned it. They had like black straps wrapped around their arms. And of course you have to have like, dreadlocks and stuff like that and black
like
makeup.
Dark makeup.
everyone knows that's sinful, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
That is the marker.
Well, that is the staple human video. Someone gets into sin, and then Jesus comes and breaks them out, depending at the climax of the song. But the funny thing is that my wife, the first time she met my mom, she was dressed up as the demon of sex.
No.
Wow.
That's so good.
Super proud of that. Maybe that has to do. Maybe that's why my mom didn't like my wife for the first year. So
I find that so weird because in my background, we did not do dramas or anything, maybe like reenacted biblical moments or something, but it was not about like even videos and,
you're deprived.
I don't know. Is really being deprived of what you're talking about doesn't necessarily seem deprived.
Well, looking back on it, it's pretty embarrassing, but at the time it was kind of fun.
Yeah, I thought the choreography was rather graceful. You did a nice job with that, Jeff.
Thank you. It's not,
you're welcome.
not too shabby for something that I stole from someone else and throw Jesus in the middle. But isn't that like the Christian way?
I think that's like everything. Yeah.
I actually did visit because you both went to the same church growing up or whatever. And I visited one time as this like outside non-charismatic person. And no joke, all I remember is something about leaving a legacy and people broke beer bottles over Jesus's head. That's all I remember.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, I've seen that one.
So that's what I'm thinking of when you guys are talking about this is
that group that came through our church had they had lighting rigs and special effects. I think there were pyrotechnics involved. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We did not have that kind of budget. We had costumes, but
yeah. Some of the skits I used to write, I'm pretty embarrassed of. But I'm sure we could spend a whole podcast talking about that. Maybe we'll do an episode on Christian entertainment and
youth groups.
Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. We got to do one on youth group, right? Just talk about all the craziness of youth group.
Yeah, youth group.
All right. Well, I think any other items anyone want to bring up before we move into our conversation? No, I take the silence to mean no. We're done. We're done talking about this. I was going to start
singing Turnaround, but I thought you would get mad at me.
I will, because it's going to be stuck in my head all day. I know it is.
I'm just so excited for this conversation that I can't think about anything else right now.
Jeff, every now and then we fall apart.
All right. All right. Well,
what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about evolution, which I think will be an interesting topic because I think we're all, especially Alan, you'll find is pretty passionate about this particular subject.
Yes.
So we'll get right into it on the other side of the music. All right, so this week we are going to take a look at the subject of evolution. This subject in particular, for me, was kind of a catalyst for my progression in how I looked at the Bible and how I looked at the church and everything, because for the longest time, it was what the Bible says is what is, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, and then eventually, I had a great Sunday school teacher that introduced me to theology, and then introduced me to the idea that there were actually other theories that people had. Some of them were the gap theory, which is fun. Maybe we'll get into, and then long days creation, where it was a play off the Hebrew word of day that could mean age or whatever. So that was kind of this catalyst for me to kind of move into a different understanding on how to read the Bible and a different understanding on how to understand the creation story in Genesis. So this subject in particular was important. How about you two? Where do you stand on this issue?
I remember vividly as a kid, maybe 11, we went to the Creation Science Institute. I think that's what it's called, in San Diego, with my folks. And then I brought literature that I got there back to my biology teacher because clearly he'd probably never heard of this before. And so just remembering a lot of feelings of being confused when he looked at this literature and looked at me and looked at the literature and got this really strange look on his face, and I didn't really know what to make of it.
For me, I grew up, this was kind of the seas that I swam in, no pun intended. Seriously, I didn't mean that pun, but it was my life. I watched videos of creation scientists, and our church talked about it all the time. And when I went to my undergrad and got my bachelor's degree, I took a test at the very end of my program and could defend the literal 7-day creation from a literary standpoint, a scientific standpoint. And it was kind of a very big makeup of my experience of God and the Bible and reality. When I transitioned away from those ways of reading the Bible and began to accept the science, evolutionary science and evolutionary biology, it was a really big deal for me. So this is something I find myself very passionate about. And obviously, a lot of Christians, especially in the United States, are very passionate about this subject too. I recently read a Pew Forum poll on the different sects of Christianity and what they believed about evolution. It was pretty striking. I think most Christians in the United States, it came out, disagree with the theory of evolution.
Oh, that's encouraging. I would have expected the opposite.
Disagree with evolution.
Oh, disagree with evolution. I'm sorry.
Yeah, disagree.
Okay.
So like,
never mind. I am not encouraged.
42% of Catholics disbelieve in evolution or whatever. 46% of Orthodox Christians. What is that? 76% of evangelical Protestants disbelieve evolution and evolutionary science. They think that there is something fundamentally flawed with the scientists who work in evolutionary biology. So it's a really big
76.
topic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wait, didn't Pope Francis just come out in favor of evolution like within recent months, right?
I do not know.
I think he did. It made news. It made international news, which is super interesting.
That would be big news because only a slim majority of Catholics believe evolution's a viable option. So that's
Well, maybe we should stop right there. And Alan, you're probably best suited to answer this question. But when we talk about evolution, what specifically are we talking about? I mean, obviously it's linked into the creation, but let's start with like a working definition of what we talk about when we're talking about evolution.
Sure. Okay. So evolution is the theory on large scale that all of life came from one place on Earth, that all of life is related because all of life has DNA and it's very similar. And through the processes of chance and adaptation, organisms changed over time and evolved to include all the different type of life that we see on Earth. And I know for Christians, this presents a problem because it is a striking comparison to what many Christians believe, and that is God created the earth, and the earth was good, and there was no evil, and that was created in 7 days. And because of a fall, we see all of the evil that we have in the world today. So on the one hand, you have many scientists saying life looks evolved, the world looks old, everything that they're seeing tells them this, and that means for millions of years, you have death and the processes of chance creating life. And then on the other side, you have Christians saying, well, that's not how it happened. God created the world good. It was created not that long ago, like 10,000 years ago. Of course, there are some people who fall along that spectrum between a strict evolutionary perspective and a strict 7-day young earth creation perspective. There's a whole bunch of options along that spectrum, but they are two fundamentally opposed ideas of how life came to be the way that it is on our planet.
Okay.
So there are theistic evolutionists, right? I mean,
Yes.
clearly, plenty of theistic evolutionists, meaning like you believe in God, but you also believe evolution is possible. But for a lot of people, if I understand this issue correctly, or at least in my circles, it's like the idea that God would cause humans to come from monkeys is very threatening because it threatens the idea that we have like an eternal soul or something sacred about us. Like if we because they separate humans from other animals as being like especially favored in God's eyes, right? So it's like it feels like a very theological threat to a lot of people.
Yeah, and just to be clear, theistic evolution is actually the idea that God helped the process along a little bit. There's a lot of Christians and people who believe God created the universe like 13 billion years ago that don't believe in theistic evolution. They believe, that chance played an integral role in bringing about the life forms that we have. Theistic evolution would be that God
made chance, it's still theistic. Okay, sorry.
But just to be like really clear, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, that theistic evolution is God stepped in at certain moments in the evolutionary process to create that like the human being, which is like this categorical difference because God played with the dice, rigged the dice or whatever. And that's very different than like a Christian who believes in, evolution as scientists speak of evolution. So that's theistic evolution, but you're totally right. This is a problem because it breaks down this notion that human beings are categorically different from the rest of the universe. Scientists would see human beings as being very connected to the life on the planet, especially because our DNA is very similar, as we are a part of the universe that is, we're less able to distinguish between humans and animals. And then on the other side of it, especially medieval Christianity and ancient religion, especially, would see humans as this like step between animals and angels or some sort of divinity. So it's an entirely different category. And you don't get that with evolution, at least without a lot of work.
Well, and I think equally an issue for people is the biblical side of it, is that mentality or that thought that the Bible has the answer for everything. And that everything is subject to whatever the Bible says. And what I have come to grasp or hold on to is that reading it in a way that's literal, especially those first 2 chapters of Genesis, is really taken away from what the intention of those texts were. It's not a textbook on how the world was created. It's a lesson on how God feels about humanity and how humanity is in relation to God and the value of humanity in of themselves, being in the image of God.
Yeah, actually, I would say the story gets way more interesting than that from a historical perspective, because there are 2 Genesis creation accounts, and arguably they were shaped and finalized in their final form during the Babylonian exile.
Yeah.
So you remember, when the first temple was destroyed and Babylon took all these Jewish captives to the center of Babylon. What was the city? I'm forgetting my history here.
Babylon.
Babylon, the Babylon.
Yeah.
They took people to Babylon. And what happened was these people encountered much older creation myths, because the Genesis story mirrors like many, many older myths of creation. And so what most scholars think happened is that in order to preserve Jewish identity during the exile, where they had arguably been like psychologically decimated of taking, the entire people apart and destroying their capital, the Israelites were trying to establish and maintain their identity. And so they actually took these existing stories and wrote them in terms of their God Yahweh and taught them to their children as a way to preserve, which I think that to me is so much more interesting to see, like how these stories were crafted in such a way that preserves how they saw God and what they viewed were the most important elements that they needed to hang on to when they're in a foreign place.
Yeah. I mean, essentially they used, shaky to describe it this way, but it's essentially satires. They took something that was common knowledge to everything, and then they crafted it in such a way that gave their people a specific identity on how they view God and how they viewed the world and everything around them.
I think the word you're looking for is maybe polemic, not just satire, like something that is challenging, another telling of history or whatever. What you're saying, Mona, is a really important point that people need to take away. All of the Old Testament that we have has been put through the process of the leaving of Israel, being in exile, and then being in this other nation and then coming back. So the things that we have been put through this filter, have been affected by time in exile. It is important to remember for Christians, any Christians that are listening to this podcast, that even before Israel was a nation, there was thousands of years of civilization, people rising to power, creating these cultures and falling and having these ideas about what the world looked like before Israel even stepped on the scene, before they could sit down their tradition, before that could be taken up, moved to a different place, and then re-recorded. Like, there was all of this history before them. It's not as if God created the world and then you have the Old Testament. The Old Testament is an ancient document that was written within an ancient culture, surrounded by cultures that existed before them and during the same time. So when we see stories that look very similar to the Genesis account, you understand the meaning of Genesis when you look at how ancient stories operated. So for me, the problem comes in with Christians, especially recently with Protestants, saying that evolution can't be right because the Bible says the earth was created in 7 days, no longer treats these stories as ancient stories, no longer treats them as ancient literature, but takes them into something that we would expect from someone's, textbook, like you said, Jeff, of science today. So respecting them as ancient documents is not only like something we should do to be honest with ourselves and to be honest with the text, but like Christians, if your whole world is going to fall because these are ancient texts and they act like ancient texts, like that's a failure to believe that God can use the medium of literature 2,000 years ago. Do you guys get what I'm saying? if you don't have faith that God can work through that, you're going to reject that and say, oh, it has to be 100% true. You know, there has to be created in 7 days or none of it matters. And like that kind of like black and white perspective fails to believe that God can use human culture to teach things about God. You know what I mean?
And I think you also have to look at how other biblical texts use those texts. Like, for example, Paul, when he's talking about Adam, he's using it in a really allegorical, typological way that is absolutely non-literal. Like, even other biblical writers and speakers did not regard these texts as like a literal sort of scientific conception. And so I think we also have to pay attention to that, like how the Bible talks about itself.
So, before you move on from that, I was taught in my undergrad that because Jesus talked about Genesis, because Paul talked about Genesis and built arguments off of them, therefore the things in Genesis of Adam and Eve have to be literally true, or else their arguments aren't valid. Like that's what we were taught.
Yeah, but the sense of literal and historical that we have today because of modernity, because of science it being what it is, like we can't comprehend what it was like for people back then to think about things in terms of like you didn't have TVs, you didn't have voice recorders, you didn't have cameras. Like there was actually no way to capture history, as it were. Like even some of the most famous historians of like early Judaism, Josephus, for example, who is a first century guy who hung out with like the Romans and the Jews, and he's got a really interesting story. But like he was a famous historian and taken as gospel by a lot of people. But like, for example, he would write about events in first person that he was not actually there, but it was taken as historically accurate in that time, because that's the best you could get is just oral history, you know?
And we're imposing our view of how we tell history, which is fairly recent, the idea of chronology and specific dates, and we're imposing that view of history onto how history was told before that, which was more allegorical. Like, here's what we learned from this lesson, or here's what we learned from this era of history, and formatting a narrative that highlighted essentially the lessons of that era as opposed to like the specific things that happen, because the specific things don't tell a story. They just are facts. And that's kind of dead.
So I think this is an important point that needs to be made before we go any further, is that there are a lot of Christians who will not consider evolution if it destroys their faith in the Bible. And I would like to invite all the Christians that believe that way to really think about the fact that if evolution is true, and if Genesis is an ancient document that does not act like a science book, that does not threaten who God is. That may threaten our ideas of the Bible, our ideas of God. But like, is it possible, consider it possible, that God might use ancient literature to speak to humanity? That God would use the language of the people to speak to the people and teach truth, however you want to, define that. And once you start there, it's almost inescapable to end up, in my opinion, obviously not everyone's, but once you start there, it's almost inescapable to end up accepting evolution because of the science and because of biblical study and all those other things. But if you don't have that piece first, you're never going to end up looking at these things in an open-minded manner. In my knowledge, there are no scientists questioning evolution because they see like, oh, this whole thing is wrong. There are some fundamental errors in the science of evolution, so therefore we have to question all of it. You have scientists. It's the best we can. You have scientists who are committed to creationism or young earth creationism, questioning evolution because they have to. Do you get what I'm saying? It's not like,
well, and a good scientist anyway isn't gonna settle on anything, because the whole point of a scientist is you're always questioning, you're always moving forward, you're never taking anything for granted as far as what you believe and where you're at, because you're always looking for something else to reveal something else. That makes sense.
And the scientific method is incredibly threatening to a lot of people. And it's threatening, like if you've heard your whole life that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and that, the Genesis story like was probably part of like the revelation at Sinai, and that this knowledge just dropped down straight from heaven into Moses's brain and he wrote it out. Like there's a lot theologically at stake if you built your faith structure around that idea that God gives that revelation directly, that through the mouth of one person that you can get actual scientific, historical reality relayed to you. There's a lot theologically that falls apart. So I can really sympathize with why it feels so threatening for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are really 3 avenues of conversation happening right now. And I think we should pick one and then like really dive into it. So you have
what are the avenues? What are our choices?
theology is what you were just mentioning. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
something theologically wrong with what you just talked about. And there are theological consequences of accepting evolution. Then there's the biblical route. We could actually really dig in and talk about the texts and talk about the ways that they differ or are similar to the ancient texts that came before them. And then there's the scientific route, talking about just some of the basic science that surrounds why we believe what we believe about evolution. So
Well,
in my mind, those are
there's a fourth one. There's a fourth one, the political history in the 20th century of why this is such a big deal for people.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
That seems so. I don't know. You seem so concept driven. I'm thinking we're sitting here, and Alan, you made some good points about how there's this large segment of Christianity that's making like a black or white. Like if this falls apart, then this falls apart, and everything's too interconnected. But they're not going to listen to this podcast and be, oh, wow, that makes so much sense. I'm going to totally change. I mean, it's a journey. I think it was a journey for all of us that incorporated the theological, the biblical, the political, all those kind of things. So maybe
exactly.
I don't know if we want to start with just sharing kind of what our transition was.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like how did you get from literal 6 days creation to wherever you are now, and what were some of the key points in that? Because I think that might be something that we're more, you know what I mean?
For me, I actually have a shorter story on this, but okay, so I was in my geology class my sophomore year at an evangelical college, so where a lot of conservative people are and like more moderate evangelicals, and my geology professor said, hey, evolution is not crazy. Like there are Christians who believe in this. And I was like, what? So he said he had just gotten back from a convention for Christian geologists. There were like 400 people there. And he said out of 400 people, only like 5 professional expert geologists were creationists out of 400, like an insanely small number. And he said, look, technically the earth could have been created in 7 days, but then God would have had to give the earth the appearance of a memory, just like God could have created us yesterday with the appearance of a lifetime of memories. And he said, it just, when it comes down to it, the earth itself has so much witness and so much testimony that it is just so old. You cannot ignore it if you are actually engaging in real science. So for me, it was like just being given permission by someone I trusted to say, hey, I can be a Christian and hold science together, and it doesn't have to fight.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is a really good argument. Like the earth and the universe looks old, and that causes a problem for people who believe in young earth creationism, because like things like seeing a star explode in the sky, right? Seeing like a different galaxy, seeing a supernova, the light would have taken a long time. You know what's really cool? There was a story that recently came out that the Hubble telescope has seen the same star explode 4 different times. There is a star.
Whoa.
There is a star, and it blew up 9 billion years ago, is our best estimate. And
because
the
light
Hubble
takes that long to
telescope,
travel at such long distances.
and because some of the light went through galaxies to get here, it was actually bended by gravity. Yeah, bent. Thank you. Bent by gravity, and took longer to get here than some of the other light that left it originally.
That's cool.
So we've seen the same star explode 4 times. If the universe is 10,000 years old, literally that star never existed, and God created the light, actually 4 different pictures of the star exploding, and sent that light to us, even though that star never existed.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is, if the universe is 10,000 years old, that God has authored a reality that is deceptive, fundamentally deceptive, that we cannot trust the science that we see around us. That to me is more troubling than a God who works in ancient storytelling and tells something about God's own self in the language of the people.
Yeah.
Right.
And
But even
that
the
idea
Bible doesn't say that the universe is 10,000 years old.
That's true.
The Bible says, in the beginning, the Spirit, Ruach, breathed over the waters of chaos. Like there was already something in existence. So you can't, I don't think, even if you're like a very extreme literalist, you cannot hold that the universe is 10,000 years old. That's just
It is
silly.
so hard for me to hear what you just said and not jump into like the biblical studies portion of like what exactly that means. The waters in the very beginning and God breathing over them. Maybe I'll do it anyway. So there was this there was this
Maybe cut Jeff off again.
This is
Okay,
actually me. This is my story. How I ended up accepting evolution is really this right here. I studied the Pentateuch, the first books of the Bible, in my master's degree program because my bachelor's degree was very conservative and did not, very against evolution. When I started to study the Pentateuch in conjunction with the other ancient texts that were older than the Pentateuch, you saw things like in the beginning for the Babylonians at Enuma Elish, there was these chaotic waters. and you have the younger gods. Like those are the two primordial gods. There's salt water and fresh water, and they're very chaotic. And then you have a younger god kill one, breathe into the other, and explode its body or whatever, and then create the firmament above and the firmament below. Very similar language to Genesis.
Is this the story of Tiamat?
Yeah, Tiamat and Apsu. So like the idea that God breathed over the waters in Genesis is like a direct polemic against the Babylonian idea that there were these other gods. It's like in the beginning, this Yahweh, this God, like over everyone, probably doesn't say Yahweh, but God breathes over the waters like Marduk breathed into Tiamat and exploded Tiamat's body or whatever. God stilled the chaos in the very beginning. And that is addressing the Babylonian epic Enuma Elish. And so like when you read that, you have to read it in the connection with the history around it, the older history that's around Genesis. And for me personally, when I realized that Genesis was this ancient document, that it didn't come in from a stork or whatever, just be handed down in some like divine fiat where like nothing else applies. When I realized it's very cultural and very human, it didn't cease to be the Bible for me. It ceased to be what I thought it was. Like I had permission to accept evolution because that's not what the Bible was dealing with in the first place. That's my own personal story.
Yeah, so for me, it was pretty similar in the sense that it was a little bit of combination of both, where it started for me with that idea that you and Mona were talking about, the whole idea of the age of the earth being deceptive. And that was that was kind of a transition moment for me to be able to be open to the idea that the earth is old, because very black and white. And then that led to the idea of what you were talking about, Alan, where there's something deeper going on here in the text and the way the literature is written. And those two things combined were really separate incidences for me that were like this progression into realizing it's not important, and then also celebrating every area of science and realizing that there's more that we can learn. And the Bible's intent was never to give us those lessons. They're not, there's nothing there that's going to tell us how to figure out how old something is or discover what a star does when it blows up or whatever. It was very important to have those moments. And I don't know if anyone listening is really interested in what Alan was talking about, the idea of, the Enuma Elish or anything like that. But there's a great book called Understanding Genesis by Nahum Sarna, and it really lays that stuff out beautifully. I don't know, just throwing that out there.
A classic text.
Yeah, well, I think it brings a whole another dimension to that story to think about people in exile, again, like saying like, no, we're rejecting all of these other visions of gods in favor of our one God who will be faithful to us and who will never fail because he's been with us since the beginning. That to me is such a more meaningful thing than trying to say, well, science and it's to me it's more meaningful even for a life of faith to see it in the context of exile and the Enuma Elish.
Yeah, absolutely. So and opens up more avenues to explore who God is. It doesn't feel like God or the things that you learn about God are confined to just this one text, but they are open-ended to everything in the universe.
If I can play the devil's advocate, maybe you guys can respond.
It's your favorite.
My favorite. There are some Christians, and I used to be this way, that are worried if Genesis 1-3, like you said, Mona, there's two different accounts and they're harmonized by a lot of Christians. If that's not literally historically true, where does the line stop? For a lot of Christians, they say, if the opening part of the Bible is just like a God-inspired myth, why isn't all of it myth? And why isn't all of it like non-historical?
Okay, well, especially for origin stories, you really don't have eyewitnesses. Anyone close to an eyewitness, right?
I just saw a meme yesterday. I'm sorry, but they'll say there was an eyewitness and it was God. And so God gave us Genesis and this is what people believe. God was the eyewitness and God gave it to us.
But I mean, as far as authorship, like, I don't think you can say that you're going to judge that text of an origin myth against like people who are like one or two people removed from like the life of Jesus, even though that has its own set of difficulties and interpretation. But you really you're saying something that's thousands of years removed as opposed to like one or two people removed within the same generation. So I think there is a line. You don't have to say it's a slippery slope. Yeah. That's silly.
That's and not to play devil's advocate to your devil's advocate, but when when someone says that, they never have because the general answer would be, well, you have to take into account the literature when it was written, how history was told, and all that kind of stuff, and the cultural aspects of it. And then the response back would be, well, I don't take the Bible culturally. It is what it is. But yet there are parts of the scripture that they would omit. And when you ask them, well, why aren't you taking that literally? And why aren't you following that, like, purity laws or whatever from the Old Testament? And then they would say, well, that's just cultural. You know what I mean? So there's no framework on the other end on how they reconcile the things that they consider to be taken seriously and then the things that they don't take seriously.
Yeah, there's no consistency there.
Exactly.
So there's like a fundamental error, like what you're talking about, is that some people believe the Bible is clear and understandable, and you could read it and apply it right now. That's how God intended it to be. And then, like, on the other side of it, it's like language only makes sense when you understand what the language is referring to, what the history of the words are, like where, like the etymology, what the cultural significance was. So on the one hand, Christians want to preserve a Bible that is very easily understood. But on the other, it's like these sentences and words have this cultural meaning that no longer exists, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's not here. And to say that it's just super simple is to literally dismiss the world and the meaning of the words itself. So that I think that's the problem. And you have to realize that, like, these texts were very meaningful for people in ways that they were not meaningful, that they're not meaningful for us. Understanding that, being able to empathize with how these people received them is part of biblical interpretation that gets thrown out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then what bothers me the most is the real world now practical application of that idea of what's right and what's wrong. I mean, in the sense that, a lot of people's response to the idea of evolution is where I'm going to take my kid out of a class that even teaches this.
No joke.
Yeah, we need to talk about education. That's a whole other animal.
We need to talk about the consequences of basing our view of the universe on an ancient perspective of the universe.
And not only that, but just the pure and simple taking someone away from any knowledge, even if you don't agree with it. Mm-hmm. The whole point of Christianity is to interact with the world with love. So how can you do that if you're eliminating a knowledge base from something that someone believes? Mm-hmm. It seems so silly to me that we would just, that's like, if they learn about evolution, it's going to lead them into the gates of hell or something.
Yeah, but for
there's
Christians,
a long history behind this.
Yes,
there's
absolutely.
a really interesting history, and that's very political history. This is what I want to talk about earlier. Can I jump in with this one really quick? Okay, so why is it such a big deal to teach evolution in schools? Even if you're teaching it alongside creationism, there's a lot of debates around this, because Christians love to say, well, evolution is just a theory, so it shouldn't be taught as fact. Okay, well, you have to look back at the history of the fundamentalist movement in the United States in like the 1920s and 30s, right? Mm-hmm. So the fundamentalists like prided themselves on like rejecting a lot of things about modernity and rejecting social gospel, those two things. So we're not using fundamentalism in like the sense of like today's fundamentalism, like ISIS, like jihadism. So we're not thinking about fundamentalism in the sense of like today, what we think of in a very pejorative sense in the way the media uses it. This is fundamentalists, people in the 20s who said, we wanted to believe in like the turn of the century idea of progressivism and that Jesus has come to teach us to make our world a better place. So we're going to institute social welfare programs and things like this. But then World War I hit, 1914 to 1918. And people said, holy crap, people are not basically good. We have to go back to the Bible. We have to bunker down literally in our views. Science and industrialism are all scary. And that's not, what Christians should be about. So 1925, the state of Tennessee passes something called the Butler Act, which made it unlawful to teach evolution in any state-funded school. Guess what other institution was brand new around this time? The ACLU was brand new. And the ACLU was actively looking for any teacher in Tennessee to stand up and say, hey, I believe in evolution, so that they could take the case to the Supreme Court. So the ACLU is looking for, the American Civil Liberties Union is looking for ground to stand on and to set a precedent for why religion should not have a stranglehold on public education. We should actually have free speech and freedom of religion in our public education systems. So they found this random teacher named John Thomas Scopes, who didn't even remember, according to PBS.org, didn't even remember teaching evolution in his class, but he personally, this is hilarious, right? Uh-huh. He personally believed in it. And so he said, sure, I will be the person. And so in Dayton, Tennessee, they started holding these trials, and the ACLU publicly made a spectacle of it just to attract attention to their like growing organization.
Scopes monkey trial, right?
The Scopes monkey trial, 1925. And the Scopes trial, he was found guilty and fined $100. But the verdict was overturned, you know? So eventually it kind of set a precedent that no, like you cannot have a law that requires people to only teach biblical creationism in school. So like think of all the political things at stake in this and all these warring people. Like there's a fundamentalist group who said, you know, we reject science and we reject scientific method. And then there's the modernist group who, like a lot of ACLU people were Christians who are saying, no, science is in concord with God, like in concordance with God. Like we can have both. And so this debate that we see now of like all these like evolution in schools, blah, that goes back so long. It's so old and it's very political. So that's the story I wanted to tell. Yeah, I don't know if we have time to put all that in there.
No, that's good.
And the thing that's most astounding is the idea that if you limit knowledge, then you know God better. It's so hard to fathom that if you can't explore anything, and if you do, you're missing out on God, who's the creator of the universe, all the stuff that goes along with that. I don't know. I just don't get it.
So do you think there's such a thing as fake knowledge that like would lead us away from God? Or do you think knowledge eventually will fold back into itself?
Sorry.
No, so I'm playing the devil's advocate now. Sure. Do you think all knowledge will eventually lead back to, it can eventually lead back to faith, but that, to me, that seems like to undermine a lot of my atheist friends who like are not led back to an idea of God. And I want to respect those beliefs too. Like I don't want to mandate that everybody who thinks will be led to a concept of God.
So at the very least, I think that if there is human knowledge, and this is an entirely different conversation, but if there is human knowledge that corresponds to reality, this outside reality outside of ourselves, then that knowledge or that reality belongs to God. And so like whether a human being ends up like recognizing that or, you know, like if God exists, then reality is God's reality. So I think that we can affirm something, even if it doesn't lead someone to God, like the truth of it as Christians, because God is the sustainer of the universe. God is the creator of the universe in whatever respect that is. Like, we can stand with other people and say, yeah, that truth like is true. And we do believe like that is a part of our faith because God is the God of everything, not just the God of our little bubble. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And on those lines, it reminds me of, to me, the way I've heard creationism leveraged is like, well, people are the center of God's universe, and therefore we have rights to take dominion over the world and over other creatures, and we don't have to be accountable for how we treat them because we are literally the most important. But if you really embrace evolution in any capacity, I think you have to say, well, we are so interconnected to the rest of the world that we can't just take a crap on it whenever we feel like it.
So that's the theological element that's at stake. I think there are two really important ones. One of them is human identity, anthropology, like what are human beings? If human beings are made in the image of God, which Christians historically have believed, what does that mean? And if evolution is true, how could human beings be made in the image of God? And there's a lot of theories out there. One of them is the like social image of God, where our relationship, our relational aspect of human beings that we relate to God is how we are made in God's image. Christians are like, Christianity is historically, for the most part, Trinitarian. You know, God existed in this like plurality of persons in one unit for all of eternity. And like human beings being made in the image of God doesn't mean like we're different than animals. It just means that we have those kinds of relations. Like we relate to God. God relates to us just like this. The theological term is perichoretic dance or whatever, just like God relates to God's own self in the Trinity. So I think there are other ways to think of the image of God, but for a lot of people, it threatens what they think human beings are. And that is that we are creative, we are like God in the sense that we are different than animals, but evolution breaks that down for the most part.
Yeah. And I mean, at this point, there's so many layers to this issue, obviously. So like the purpose of our conversation is to start a conversation. So hopefully we will hear from you about what you think or maybe some aspects that we might have missed. And I'm sure at some point that this subject can spawn off into a whole nother show, depending upon the feedback. Yeah.
But it shall evolve.
if I could just put a little plug in, there is a 4-part series on the blog that I wrote a couple years ago that is called Love for the Bible Led Me to Evolution, part 1 through 3. And I go through the biblical study side, scripture, science, the consequences, stuff like that of evolution. And it's some of the things that we talked about. It's not the whole conversation, but if you're interested, you can take a look at that on the blog.
That'd be great. And we will definitely put links to that in the show notes if you're interested in that. Don't forget to always check out our blog and see what's new on the site. So on the other side of the music, we'll wrap things up. All right, this week we are going to play a little game of Jesus Juke. This name, well, Alan, you explain where the name comes from and how we came up with this game.
Sure. John Acuff, or Acuff, I don't know how to say his name, is a blogger and Facebook user extraordinaire. And he came up with the idea that a lot of times you hear in public someone say something or someone does something, and then a Christian takes that situation or that comment and then just like wings it toward Christianity, like steers a conversation toward Jesus. And he called it Jesus Juking.
So what we're going to do is each of us have come up with an item, and the other two have to Jesus Juke it, turn it into some kind of illustration or spiritualization of what that object can mean. And then the host who picked the word gets to decide which one they like the best. So, are we ready?
Ready.
Hopefully this is not as irreverent as I think it's going to be.
It could very well be.
I want to apologize in advance for what I'm about to do. Lord, forgive me.
Oh, goodness. All right. Well, then, Mona, go ahead. Let's just pull the Band-Aid. Go ahead and do it first.
Guys, tell me about Viagra.
Oh. Alan, after you.
Sure. Okay. So, just like there are so many men in the United States and around the world whose lives are lacking something, they have this hole that they can't fill. Wow, that's really not appropriate. They have something inside of themselves that they need. They have certain needs that they can't fill or fulfill. And just like Viagra brings something new to their lives and gives them purpose and energy, Jesus can do the exact same thing for you. You take Jesus and you pray, you speak with Jesus, you read the Bible, and for at least 4 hours, you're more connected to God than ever.
Oh, man, this is super uncomfortable. Thank you, Mona, for this one.
Mine is innocent by comparison. So
I can see our listeners just.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't even know if that's usable. Holy.
No, it is. Yeah. We're good to go.
Okay.
Okay. So my turn.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let me. Okay. Wow. All right. You have those moments in your personal quiet time where you're praying and you just feel like your prayers are just bouncing off the walls and they're not reaching to where God is. But prayer, when done correctly, is like Viagra for your spiritual life. It causes your soul to rise to the occasion and reach up. And wow, that's inappropriate. I'm just gonna stop right there and let Mona declare the winner.
Not before I sing the famous song, "You raise me up so I can."
Wow.
We have officially destroyed at least half of my relationships. I hope you know that. Grandma, I am so sorry. I love you.
Alan, I think you got that one. I have to give it to Alan.
Thank you. Cue the cheering. Here we go. Champion. Okay, well,
I'm sorry.
My object for you two is a little bit less scandalous, probably less fun too. So thank you. It is a black and white striped sock, like that you put on your foot.
Okay.
In your shoe.
All right. Well, since I made Alan go first, I'll go first on this one. A black and white striped sock.
Channel that inner youth pastor and give us something.
Oh man, I have a feeling that I'm going to lose every game when it comes to this one. All right. Okay. In life, we face difficulties in our spiritual walk, and we will continue to face difficulties if we allow our life to become gray, if we allow ourselves to compromise, if we allow ourselves to not stand for the things that are important. So just like when you put on that black and white striped sock, think that in your walk, that the world you're looking at is black and white, and there is right and there is wrong. And to follow Jesus correctly, you need to always remember that and never, ever walk in the gray.
Nice. Very nice.
All right, I got one. So, I live on the East Coast where it's very cold, and often I feel in my spirit that socks are kind of like prisons for my feet. And I long to just romp in the green hills of my homeland in my flippy floppies. And, I just want to say that Jesus does not offer us bondage. We do not need to put on the black and white striped sock of this world, but rather be barefooted and free. And at this point, I will have a sermon illustration where I light the sock on fire and throw it up in the air and it disappears.
If you throw fire in there, you're gonna win. That's totally cheating.
I know. I'm gonna declare the winner to be Jeff, because that's a little bit cheap. Resorting to pyrotechnics doesn't quite do it for me.
Thank you. I agree.
I want to live my life very clear of who I am, and the gray is bad. So I'm definitely going to go with Jeff. But your flippy floppy illustration was really good.
Yeah, I was actually inspired to
uplifted.
Go outside barefooted and experience the world.
You guys suck.
All right. You ready for my word?
Hey, Mona, you're going to go first, so prepare yourself.
I'm preparing myself. All right.
Does that work out so that everyone goes first once?
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, look at that. We're
Math.
awesome. All right.
Amazing.
You ready? Okay, the word is tacos.
Oh, God. All I can think about is being at a sleepover with Alan's wife. And in the middle of the night, I thought everyone was sleeping. And all of a sudden she was laying on her back. She put all 4 limbs up in the air and goes, "Look, I'm a taco." And then just falls over to one side like dead fish. And I laughed for like half an hour because I was very sugar hyped and sleep deprived. But yeah. Oh, that reminds me of Vicky.
Weird.
Okay.
She did that once. I had no idea where that came from. I thought it was like the most random thing ever. Wow.
Oh yeah, I mean it was when
That's
I heard
pretty
it,
awesome.
too. That was like back to 6th grade or something.
That is very very much her.
It is. My sister is pretty impressive.
She is.
All right. In life, you can fill your heart with a lot of things. You can fill your heart with like the lettuce of video games and the cheese of friendships. But you can fill yourself with lots of things, and really when Jesus comes along, Jesus just scoops out all of your taco fillings and replaces it with perfectly seasoned taco meat. And that is the fruits of the Holy Spirit. I'm mixing my metaphors, but it doesn't even matter because I'm so compelling. And then you can eat the Jesus taco with confidence, knowing that your soul is filled with goodness.
It was good. Alan.
Jeff.
I literally feel like
Alan.
This is going to be very difficult. This is here we go. So how there are taco trucks and vendors, especially in LA. There's this big craze lately about how there's these apps that tell people when food carts are around the corner or by their business, and it's one of the quickest booming businesses these days. And they're just so attractive, especially taco carts. That's my personal favorite. But like, you just get this hankering like for a taco when you see the picture on the side of the cart and it looks so good, and it's brought to your work, and you just step out of your office and you go buy one. Like that service, that bringing the taco to the people is exactly what we need to do in our Christian lives with the message of God. We should be making it look attractive. We should be developing apps and like calling people where they are at to come to the taco cart of our faith and taste and know that the Lord is good.
Oh my God, you are so good at this.
See, I know this might be controversial, but I'm gonna have to go with Mona on that one. Only because I think
because
that
it works.
I think that you did a great job if I said taco truck, but I said
Sure.
the taco specifically. So that's that's my only
I don't
qualm.
want to win on a technicality though.
Well,
Don't
you
just
lost
give it
on
to
a
me, guys.
technicality, so
That's true.
I did.
So it just evens
Vengeance.
out. The universe
Oh,
corrects
we're
itself.
all winners.
all winners.
Guys.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us this week. And for those of you listening, that may have done it for you forever. But please don't forget to support the podcast. You can rate, review, and subscribe to us through iTunes or wherever else you might get your audio content. And check out our blog at irenicast.com. And as always, we want to hear from you. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns for the podcast, email us at podcast@irenicast.com. Follow us on Twitter @irenicast or on Facebook at facebook.com/irenicast. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Oh, and I'm sorry, before I forget, we want to, although we're a discussion-based podcast, so, we're not sitting here all the time and giving specific research for stuff. There is going to be time to time where something we say is probably way outside of the scope of actual research. So we just want to have the time where we give a couple corrections and omissions, I guess. So from our conversation on the Christian response to war, we did have a couple things that we wanted to clarify. So Mona and Alan, I believe you had a couple things.
Yeah, so I said something like we have 200 military bases throughout the world. Speculatively, there's actually closer to between 600 and 900 bases, and this is research based on politifact.com, and that's the numbers from 2011. So more realistically, we have bases in 63 countries and about 600 bases, which is higher than what I originally said, but I just wanted to make sure we got some proper numbers in there.
Similar mistake I made. I said that the United States government replaced their jets with a better version to the tune of about $40 billion. It's actually $400 billion, which is just a little bit different. The good news is both the statements made by Mona and I were conservative estimates. So if we're going to make mistakes, we're going to hedge our bets. And
there you go.
There you go.
Yeah. That's a very good point. So in the future, we would love to hear from you. So, contact us up if you have any corrections or omissions for us, and we will make sure that we do right by you. And until then, thanks for joining the conversation.